Have you ever sat at a family dinner feeling like a ghost? Present in body but completely invisible in spirit. I was at my brother's engagement dinner, an island of simple gray cashmere in an ocean of bespoke suits and diamond earrings. The air itself felt expensive. When my brother's fiancée, Sophia, a woman with a genuinely curious gaze, turned to me, my father smoothly cut in before I could even say hello. "And this," he said with a smile that never reached his eyes, gesturing toward me as if I were a piece of art he pitied, "is our little artist in residence, still trying to find a canvas that pays." He had just summed up my entire existence to them a charming, but ultimately worthless, failure. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you'd consider subscribing to my channel, it would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Clara, and I've always understood that my family operates on a different frequency than I do. Their world is loud, sharp, and polished to a high gloss, a place of ringing stock market bells and the satisfying snap of a well-closed business deal. It's a world of hard numbers and tangible assets, of things that can be quantified, appraised, and leveraged. Mine is a world of quiet patience, of the scent of damp earth and the slow, miraculous unfurling of a single leaf. It's a world of potential, of things that grow unseen. My grandmother, a brilliant botanist whose work was always gently dismissed by her own children as a charming eccentricity, was the only one who ever truly understood my frequency. "They see the flower." Clara, she once told me, her hands covered in soil as we repotted orchids in her greenhouse. "But you understand the roots. That's a rarer and more powerful sight." She was the one who gave me my first microscope, a beautiful antique brass instrument that my mother tried to replace with a doll. I still have it on my desk, a constant reminder of the one person who saw my path not as a detour, but as a destination. I once overheard her telling my father, Arthur, "You measure success in dollars. The girl measures it in lives. Be careful you don't miscalculate which currency has more value in the end." He had simply laughed it off, patting her on the shoulder as if she were a senile old woman. That evening, the difference between our worlds had never felt more like a chasm. We were seated in a private room at Le Ciel, a restaurant where the plates were wider than my laptop screen and the waiters moved with the silent, unnerving grace of shadows. The occasion was to celebrate my older brother Ethan's engagement to Sophia. My father, Arthur, had chosen the venue. Of course, for him, a meal wasn't about nourishment. It was a statement of power, a performance. The sommelier had just finished a reverent monologue about a particular Bordeaux, directing his entire performance to my father and Ethan, who nodded along with practiced authority. I might as well have been part of the floral centerpiece for all the attention they paid me. I remembered being a child at similar dinners, trying to talk about a fascinating insect I'd found, only to be told by my father to use your inside voice, Clara, while Ethan was praised for loudly recounting a playground victory. It was the same pattern that repeated at my high school science fair. I'd won first place for a complex hydroponics system I'd built from scratch. My father showed up for the photo, spent the entire time on a business call, and later told one of his partners on the way out, "It's cute. She has her little hobbies to keep her busy." The same year, Ethan got a brand new convertible for making the varsity golf team. The disparity was never malicious. It was just a fact, as natural as gravity in our household. I felt like a misplaced prop on my father's stage, my simple moss green cashmere sweater, a small luxury I'd bought myself after securing my first round of seed funding, felt homespun and clumsy amidst the sea of Tom Ford suits and the subtle glint of my mother's diamond earrings. The conversation flowed around me, a torrent of market projections and acquisition strategies. I sat stirring my glass of water, tracing the condensation with my fingertip, a ghost at their feast. It was a familiar feeling, the same invisibility I'd felt at countless family holidays, where the main event was a competitive comparison of year-end bonuses. I recalled one Thanksgiving when they hired a professional photographer for a family portrait. I had been in the garden, retrieving a forgotten herb for the stuffing. I saw them gathering on the lawn through the kitchen window and paused, expecting someone to call for me. Instead, my mother just smiled and waved before turning back to the group. The photographer even asked, "Is this everyone?" And I heard my mother's clear voice reply, "Yes, this is the family." They took the photo without me. When I pointed it out later, my mother had patted my cheek and said, "Oh, sweetie, we didn't even notice. Don't worry, we'll Photoshop you in." They never did. The framed portrait now sat on the mantelpiece in their living room, a glossy, smiling lie with a conspicuous Clara-shaped hole in the composition. Sophia was the only one who seemed to notice I was there. She had an intelligent, focused gaze that didn't just look at you, but seemed to actually see you. She turned to me, her smile genuine, cutting through the thick fog of financial jargon. "Clara, your work sounds fascinating. How are things going?" Before I could form a single word, my father intercepted the question with the ease of a seasoned diplomat. He leaned forward, refilling Sophia's wine glass, his movements grand and deliberate. "Oh, don't you worry about our Clara," he said, his voice slick with a practiced, paternal charm that always set my teeth on edge. He gestured towards me with the wine bottle, a casual flick of the wrist that dismissed my entire life's work. "This is our little artist in residence," he announced to the table, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. "Still trying to find a canvas that pays." The table chuckled politely, a sound I knew all too well. It was the sound of my family lovingly, gently, pushing me back into the box they had built for me. It was the same tone he'd used years ago, when I won a prestigious university grant for my research. He'd toasted me at dinner by calling it my nice little hobby fund. Ethan had followed up by joking that I could now afford to buy my own ramen noodles for a year. The comment wasn't a fresh wound. It was the familiar, dull ache of an old one. For years, I had yearned for them to see the value in what I did, to understand that my work wasn't measured in quarterly earnings, but in the potential to feed millions. My currency was a strain of wheat that could thrive in a drought, not the fluctuating value of a tech stock. But all they saw was their daughter, perpetually smudged with dirt, chasing a fruitless academic hobby. I remembered my 25th birthday, when their gift was a self-help book titled Finding Your Path. The message was clear the path I was on was the wrong one. Inside, my mother had inscribed, "It's never too late to start over. Darling." The party itself was filled with their friends and business associates, none of whom I knew. I opened their gift in front of a crowd of strangers who nodded sagely at the title, murmuring about how hard it is for young people these days. My mind drifted to a phone call from a few months prior. My mother, Helen, had called, her voice breezy and cheerful. "Darling, you'll never guess what we've done. We finally tore down that dreadful old shed in grandmother's garden. It's going to be a marvelous tennis court, so important to keep active. You know." I had remained silent on my end of the line, my throat closing up. That dreadful old shed had been my first laboratory. It was a sanctuary of damp earth and rotting wood, where the afternoon sun would slant through the dusty window panes, illuminating rows of carefully tended seedlings. It was where a 10-year-old girl, inspired by her botanist grandmother, first dreamed of changing the world. It was the only place in that house where I felt seen. After my grandmother passed, I had carefully preserved her botany journals there, books filled with her elegant script and detailed drawings. The name of my company, Viridian Growth, was inspired by a passage in one of those very journals about the endless, viridian potential of a single, well-nurtured seed. To my mother, it was just an eyesore to be cleared away for a more respectable pastime. It was a message, delivered with a cheerful smile. Your past, your passion, it's all disposable. When I later asked what happened to the journals, she'd waved a dismissive hand and said, "Oh, those dusty old things, I'm sure they're in a box somewhere in the attic." I knew I would never see them again. To protect that passion, I had learned to live a double life in the world of agricultural technology. I was C. Vance, an anonymous, almost mythical founder whose research papers were creating seismic shifts in the industry. I operated Viridian growth from the shadows, my identity shielded by layers of legal agreements. I had to. The giants of the agrochemical industry were like sharks circling, ready to devour any innovation that threatened their bottom line. My secrecy wasn't a choice, it was a necessity for survival. The stress of managing a remote international team across 12 time zones, while my family thought I was unemployed, was immense. But the work was too important. There were nights I'd fall asleep on my keyboard, only to be woken an hour later by an urgent call from my lead developer in Berlin about a catastrophic bug in our code. A crisis I had to navigate alone in the dark of my small apartment. Once, my mother had shown up unannounced while I was on a video call with investors, and I'd had to slam my laptop shut and pretend I was watching a movie, the adrenaline coursing through me for hours afterward. To my family, however, my secrecy was just further proof of my failure. They saw my small apartment, my beat-up car, and my polite refusal of their financial help as signs of a stubborn, struggling artist who couldn't admit defeat. My father had once slipped a check into my coat pocket, a discreet offer to help with rent that felt more like a branding of my incompetence than an act of kindness. I'd mailed it back to his office the next day without a note. He'd later tried to establish a trust fund for me, but the terms were suffocating, giving him final say over any expenditure over $500. He called it fatherly guidance. I called it a gilded cage. My refusal had led to a month of icy silence. They couldn't imagine that while they were closing a deal on a new high-rise. I was finalizing a partnership with the World Food Program, a deal that would bring my drought-resistant grains to sub-Saharan Africa. The ultimate insult had come just last week, disguised as brotherly concern. Ethan had called, his voice dripping with a fake, syrupy sympathy that made my skin crawl. "Hey, Clara," he'd begun. "Listen, with the dinner coming up and Sophia's family being so, prominent, I was thinking." I waited, knowing what was coming. It was always the same pattern, a declaration of my inadequacy wrapped in the pretty paper of a favor. It reminded me of the time he'd laughed at a family gathering when a cousin asked what I did. "She talks to plants," he'd snorted, and the room had laughed with him. "I know things are probably a bit tight for you," he continued, the feigned sensitivity making it worse. "I was thinking I could set you up with a position at my firm, just some data entry to start. To get your foot in the door of the real world. It's time to give up that little gardening hobby, don't you think?" I remember staring out my apartment window at the city lights, the phone pressed hard against my ear. On my laptop screen was the final draft of the agreement with the UN, a document that represented the culmination of a decade of relentless work. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. He was offering me a cage, not knowing I was on the verge of setting the world free. "Thanks, Ethan," I'd said, my voice dangerously calm. "But I'm fine." Back at the dinner table, the performance continued. My mother had now taken the lead, turning to Sophia with a sigh of theatrical maternal worry. "We just hope she'll find a nice, stable young man to settle down with soon," she said, squeezing my hand. The pressure was more of a warning than a comfort. A steady career can be so overwhelming for a woman. It was her favorite refrain, one she'd repeated ever since I'd chosen to pursue my doctorate instead of an MRS degree. That was it, the final condescending straw. I saw a flicker in Sophia's eyes. Her polite smile vanished, replaced by the intense focus of a journalist on the scent of a story. She looked from my mother's anxious face to my calm one, and I could almost see the gears turning in her brilliant mind, connecting invisible dots. She'd been asking me sharp, specific questions all evening about my hobby questions about soil nutrient density and aeroponic technology that my family couldn't even begin to comprehend. Each time, one of them had cut me off to redirect the conversation to something more interesting, like Ethan's golf handicap. She set down her wine glass with a soft click that sounded like a gavel in the suddenly quiet room. "Clara," she said, her voice low and serious, cutting through my mother's chatter. This might seem like an odd question, but What is your middle name? The air crackled with tension. All eyes were on me. It's Vance, I said, my voice steady. Sophia's eyes widened. She picked up her tablet from the seat beside her, her thumbs moving swiftly across the screen. She didn't say another word. Instead, she simply turned the tablet to face my family. On the screen was the draft of a cover story for a major tech and innovation magazine. The headline was in bold, declarative letters, "The Mystery of C. Vance, the Ghost in the Machine Feeding the World." Below it was not a picture of me, but the clean green logo of my company, Viridian Growth. My father stared at the screen, the color draining from his face. His charming smile froze, then seemed to crack like thin ice. I watched his hand, the one holding his wine glass, begin to tremble ever so slightly. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her perfectly applied lipstick suddenly looking garish and clownish against her pale, shocked skin. Ethan looked from the tablet to me and back again, his jaw literally hanging open, his face a pathetic cocktail of disbelief, jealousy, and a dawning, sickening horror as he realized he'd offered a data entry job to his fiancée's mysterious tech idol. Sophia didn't need to explain. She let the silence do the work. Then, she turned her cool, analytical gaze on my brother, and I saw him shrink under her stare. "Your father said he wanted to introduce me to the most brilliant mind in the family," she said, her voice clear and cutting. "I just didn't realize he was talking about your sister." For the first time in my entire life, my family was utterly silent. The sound was magnificent. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to say, "I told you so." Their stunned, horrified faces were more eloquent than any words I could have spoken. Slowly, deliberately, I placed my linen napkin on the table beside my untouched plate. I pushed my chair back, the soft scrape against the polished floor the only sound in the room. I stood up and looked at Sophia, offering her a small, genuine smile. "It was a pleasure to finally meet you," I said. Then I turned my gaze upon my family. They were like statues carved from regret. "I have an early call with the World Food Program delegation tomorrow morning," I said, my voice even and calm. "Enjoy the rest of your dinner." I walked out of that room. I didn't run. I didn't look back. I walked through the main dining hall, past the curious glances of other patrons who had sensed the silent, sudden shift in the atmosphere, and out into the cool, liberating night air. The feeling of it on my face was like the first clean breath after a long illness. The silence that followed me wasn't the awkward, pitying silence I was used to. It was the sound of their world being irrevocably shattered. As I stepped onto the pavement, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The screen lit up with a notification: "Missed call from Arthur." I didn't pause. I swiped the notification away, deleting it without a second thought. I had never needed their approval to succeed. I had only needed to believe in myself and in the memory of my grandmother's earthy, knowing hands. They hadn't lost a daughter that night. They had lost her years ago, piece by piece, with every dismissive comment, every pitying glance. Tonight, they just finally realized she was gone.